When in February 2014 Russian incognito tanks without state markings occupied Crimea, the entire world watched the events on the picturesque Black Sea Peninsula with significant concern. Despite the Kremlin's constant narrative about the peaceful fulfillment of the Crimean inhabitants' will, the international community had no doubts about the hostile intentions of the Russian Federation. However, over 7 years have passed since then, and the world, and more strikingly Europe, seems to disregard the fact that there is still a war going on its periphery. Moreover, there are signs that this conflict may continue to worsen. Let's look at the situation in Ukraine. Welcome to the 20th report. Let's shortly recall the events. After the rapid action of the so-called Little Green Men in Crimea and the annexation of the geostrategically critical Crimean Peninsula by the Russian Federation, the escalation of separatist movements supported by the Kremlin occurred in the Donbas. As a result, a pro-Russian rebellion broke out, which led to the establishment of the self-proclaimed People's Republics in Donetsk and Lugansk. The army of Ukraine responded militarily. However, despite the establishment of several diplomatic platforms, including the Minsk talks and the Normandy format, the war in eastern Ukraine continues, while the world seems to have forgotten about it. In February 2020, the annual Munich Security Conference took place. It is one of the largest events of its kind in the world, bringing together heads of state, governments, senior state officials and experts on international affairs. In the official Munich security report from this event, which covers over 70 pages, Ukraine is mentioned only 7 times. In the list of 10 conflicts that the world community should pay attention to, the war in eastern Ukraine was placed last, giving way to problems in Burkina Faso, Ethiopia or Kashmir. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, euphemistically referred to the report at the press conference, saying that such a presentation of reality unpleasantly surprised him. As he reminded, in the east of Ukraine there is a constant struggle for values common to all Europeans and Westerners. The picture was completed by the fact that Zelensky's speech took place in the side room at the same time as the speech of the Chinese foreign minister, which proves that the organizers treated it as an event of lower importance. Even more controversial was the report called 12 Steps Toward Greater Security in Ukraine and the Euro-Atlantic Region, published on the official website of the Munich Security Conference. It was prepared by several European think tanks in cooperation with the Russian Center for International Affairs, and has been signed by, among others, retired American General Philip M. Breedlove. The general assumption of the authors was that the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine is essentially its internal problem, and the solution to the problem, apart from the participation of the West and Russia, requires starting a discussion on the identity of this country. In the entire material there is not the slightest mention of the Russian aggression in Crimea and Donbas. The report disappeared from the official website of the Munich conference shortly after the publication, and the organizers distanced themselves from its assumptions. However, the milk has spilled. A team of American experts from the Atlantic Council quickly counteracted the report. Although they diplomatically agreed on some points, still strongly opposed to a couple of them, which they directly called duplicating the Kremlin's narrative and corresponding with Moscow's wishes. Without Kremlin leadership financing weapons, including heavy arms, ammunition and in some cases regular units of the Russian army, there would be no conflict in and around Ukraine, the authors concluded. Less delicate in words was Ivana Kłympusz-Cyncadze, former Ukrainian deputy prime minister responsible for European integration, who called the Munich conference Putin's friends meeting. The failed format. Also in the Atlantic Council, which probably isn't accidental, the Ukrainian deputy prime minister Alexei Reznikov, who is responsible for Donbas negotiations, writes about the deadlock over the conflict in Ukraine. He argues that the so-called Normandy format, which is the talks on the Kiev-Berlin-Paris-Moscow axis, has reached a dead end. Reznikov explains that Kiev treats negotiations to strengthen its sovereignty, while Moscow has exactly the opposite goal: undermining its neighbor's sovereignty, interfering with its internal interests, and permanently opposing Ukraine's international policy. Therefore, the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister asked what the Normandy format is supposed to serve. Kiev realizes that it is a buffer that protects Europe from the Russian revisionism. However, as negotiations fail, the conflict may escalate further and eventually move 1,300 kilometers west and reach the eastern border of the European Union, specifically Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania. This can be read as a clear invitation mainly for Warsaw and Bucharest for greater involvement in the matter and perhaps to remodel the Normandy format. The tweet by President Zelensky, who congratulated the re-election of Polish President Andrzej Duda, where he wrote, "Together we are stronger," is also a reference to the common threat that both countries share. War. Act 2. The fact that Ukraine is looking for allies is not surprising, especially in the context of Putin's recent signing of the decree on the conscription of reserve troops. According to the concerned Ukrainian observers, the mobilization may be caused by the planned attack on Ukraine scheduled for autumn, which would be coordinated with the Caucasus 2020 exercises. All the previous similar decrees predetermined the time frame, which was usually up to 2 months. The current decree is indefinite. As the Ukrainian Lieutenant General Leonid Golopatyuk said, 3 large military groups are stationed at the border with Ukraine, capable of the offensive at any time, without the need to transfer troops or mobilize. According to Golopatyuk, Russia has gathered about 87,000 military personnel, up to 1,100 tank units, 2,600 armored fighting vehicles, 1,100 artillery systems, 360 multiple launch missile systems, and 18 tactical operational missile systems. Additionally, we should count the forces stationed in Crimea, which, like Kaliningrad, make up one large military base. The Russian attack would be aimed at taking control of the Kherson and northern Crimea Canal. The supposed reason would be the catastrophic hydrological situation in Crimea. Before the war, Ukraine supplied the peninsula with the water from the Kherson Oblast. The Ukrainian authorities, not surprisingly, decided that the water will be not delivered to the peninsula until it's returned under Kiev's control. Even less optimistic visions were presented by the Ukrainian Counter-Admiral Oleksiy Neyshpapa, who explicitly stated that the Ukrainian Navy is preparing for a military confrontation with Russia and is strengthening its positions. We are preparing for a full-scale war confrontation, understanding that if it occurs, unfortunately, there will be many losses, both among our military and civilians. Many do not understand it, but the country is in the 7th year of war. However, he stressed that the Ukrainian army is preparing not only for the war in the Donbas trenches, but also for offensive actions, including working in the urban conditions, conducting combat operations not only in defense and for maneuvering operations. Besides, he also mentioned that the most likely assumption of the attack would be the resumption of water supplies in Crimea. The attack could be carried out under the cover of the announced Caucasus 2020 exercises. American General Ben Hodges, who until recently was the commander-in-chief of American troops in Europe, recently raised similar concerns. The situation is not improved by the revealed revelations of John Bolton, who wrote that Donald Trump does not like Ukraine, and the fact of recent frequent telephone contacts between the US and Russian presidents. Hope. Less. The disastrous position of Kiev is complemented by the dreadful epidemiological and economic situation, which is affected by the poor harvest of grain, which is one of the Kiev's major export products. The conditions are not stabilized by the internal political situation as well. Former President Petro Poroshenko said for the BBC that Zelensky is an inexperienced man and the only thing he can do is a television show, referring to the president's media past. However, a more serious accusation is the presence of pro-Russian people in Zelensky's immediate entourage, whom Poroshenko directly calls the Kremlin's fifth column. What information is coming from the Kremlin? Alexander Borodai, once short-lived prime minister of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, confirmed that Donetsk residents with Russian passports had taken part in the recent referendum as citizens of the Russian Federation and expressed the hope that the territory would soon become part of Russia de jure. Borodai was diplomatically followed by the deputy head of the Russian Federation's Foreign Affairs Committee, Vladimir Jabarov, who said that although Russia's goal is not to gain territorial gains, Kiev is doing everything possible to push Donbas out of Ukraine. He added that the question of belonging is a sovereign decision of the people living in the region. The Kremlin used similar rhetoric during the annexation of Crimea. The situation in Ukraine is extremely difficult at present. The country must prepare for the worst-case scenario, which is the second offensive by Russian troops. The shaky world order is diverting attention from the war that has been waged in Europe for 7 years. It favors the Kremlin's plans to pursue a new concert of powers and expand its influence further west, whereas Ukraine moving westward is an unacceptable scenario for Moscow. Hey guys, I hope you liked the video. If you did, please leave a like and let me know what do you think about the situation in Ukraine and the possible escalation. For now, thank you for watching and I will see you next time.